Alrighty, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us on this fine Tuesday for a behavior analyst talks about guns and multiple causation. This was to air last month. However, we did have a rescheduling, so thank you all for joining us for this session today. And it's going to be a very interesting one. I already am very excited for it. So listen for just a few minutes while I blab on a little bit, and then I will be able to turn it over to Dr. Catania for the content. But so during the next just about 2 hours, you're going to have the chance to earn 2 CEUs. And the way that you're going to earn those CEUs is one, by you already have done step one and have joined with that unique link that was emailed to you when you registered. So thank you so much. Now, if you did not use that unique link that was emailed and you're dialed in audio only, which means that you're not on a computer or anything like that. You just hear it through the speaker of your phone, like you're on a phone call. Then please also sign in with that link that was emailed to you, even if you're having technical difficulties. This way, GoToWebinar can actually record your attendance and let us know that you are here and you are participating. But if you are dialed in audio only and not also logged in with that unique link, then as I said, GoToWebinar is not going to let us know that you're here. So you won't be able to get any kind of certificate because we won't have data to be able to say, hey, yeah, we can try to get you to sign this to say that you were here because we have zero data, so we can't do anything at all. So even if it's giving you trouble, go ahead and use that unique link that was sent to you in your email. Please do not forward that link to anybody as it's unique to you. So if you forward it to a coworker to also join this webinar, then they're going to be joined as you, and you're not going to be able to, they won't be able to get participation in their own name. Now, you'll also be needing to answer poll questions that are popping up throughout the presentation today. So please, as I said, make sure that you are logged in with that unique link so this way you can participate in those polls. If you didn't purchase the ability to earn CEUs yet, that's okay. Go ahead and do that anytime, but I will be analyzing the data first thing tomorrow, so you will have your certificate instructions to you by lunchtime tomorrow. But all right, I think that's all I'm going to have to say for now. If you have questions, go ahead and throw them into the questions box. I did put a handout into the handout section that was emailed a couple of hours ago. If you didn't get that email, you can either send us an email to get it attached, or you can download it from the handout section of your control panel. But I think that's all I'm going to say for now, and I'll go into more detail about CEUs and all that good stuff when the first one pops up. But here is Dr. Catania.
Greetings all. And as you can see, what we're going to be talking about today is guns, and in particular, the behavior analytic spin we'll be putting on this is to talk about guns and guns as they are involved in behavior, of course, in terms of multiple causation. Now, this when I first got started with this, and we started doing various talks about sessions, and some of them, our topics were delicate, and I ended up putting in trigger warnings. And it only just occurred to me, I've included this warning for earlier topics. We talked about discrimination, we talked about sex, and surely a warning is appropriate for guns as a topic, but I didn't notice until I was working on it that it also illustrates another kind of multiple causation. So forgive me. Trigger warning was not meant originally as a pun, and it only later occurred to me that there's multiple causation in that one. In any case, it's almost inevitable that you might find some of the content of this presentation disturbing or offensive. I find some of the content disturbing and offensive. Now, we tend to look at guns and we regard it as an American thing, but it's not just an American thing. I want to start off just reminding you that Mao Zedong, in taking control of China back in the days of the Communist Revolution in his Long March, one of his quotations is, "Political power grows out of the barrel of a gun." I worry sometimes that some of the things that are going on with respect to gun control in the United States show that that's not just a communist statement. I believe that there are some political groups that feel that's still the case in our country too, and it shouldn't be election booths. Well, some of the kinds of things I'll be talking about as we get through here are also summarized to some extent in my textbook, The ABCs of Behavior Analysis. I've drawn some of this material from there, but I also have some new material. If any of you are interested in it, there's a link here to Sloan Publishing where those of you who have participated in this can get a discount from if you just go to this link. And so I feel I ought to let you know that that's available. Now, when I first did this, I didn't even realize that I'd have a direct connection with these issues. So I'm going to start a little bit with some personal history with regard to guns. When I was a little kid growing up, even though that was during World War II, and one of the things that you did was to play soldier. And of course, you'd, as a kid, be enacting battles and all of those kinds of things. But my mother wouldn't let any guns, even toy guns, be around the house. And as I got older, I eventually heard the family story. Back in February 14th, 1920, a long time ago, more than 100 years ago, my mother, who was one in a fairly large family, actually the total was 12, but probably some of those were kids who were stillborn. But anyway, she had a younger brother and a younger sister, and she was babysitting them or essentially escorting them to a local movie theater. Movies were relatively new in those days. Going to the movies was a big deal. So she went with a younger brother, Peter, a friend of his, and her younger sister, Louisa, who was born in 1913. So Louisa would have been, at that time, 7 years old. My mother probably was in her mid-teens, maybe a little bit young, maybe preteen. While they were there waiting for the movie theater to open, Peter and his friend went and played in an adjoining vacant lot, and there they found a gun. They were playing with it, and it went off. Um, Peter's friend had it, and it went off. The bullet went through his hand and into Peter's abdomen, into his, what we'd say, his stomach. My mother ran home to summon her parents while Peter was taken inside the door of a local drugstore, and her younger sister Louisa remained nearby, and he died later that day. In those days, you laid out the bodies at home, and so his body was laid out in the family living room until his burial. My mother's younger sister Louisa became reclusive. Eventually, she was institutionalized, and she died in a New York State mental facility in 1982. My mother never got over that, of course, as you might expect. But here we're talking about a gun death of a child dying, finding a gun, playing with the gun, goes off accidentally. Peter would have been my uncle, but I never met him, obviously. And recently, in getting into the gun issues, I recognize that this is part of my story too. How many people are touched by these kinds of things? Apparently, something like a third of the population of kids in elementary and middle schools these days can have just a small number of connections to somewhere where there has actually been a shooting or they learned of a shooting. And so we got a country full of traumatized kids who worry about whether in school somebody's going to come in and shoot them. We live in a strange country. So it's more than a century. Other causes of death besides guns have become less prevalent, mostly with progress in medicine. Yet in recent years, gun deaths have become the leading source of mortality among children and teenagers. The leading source. More kids and teenagers die of guns than of any other well, I guess if you wanted to say all diseases and group them together, that'd be another story. So what I want to do is to spend some time looking at some of the data and looking at the way we talk about it. It's very hard, given all of the things that exist and the contingencies out there in our culture, to know what to do about it. But at least we as behavior analysts should be able to look at it and perhaps come up with something constructive to say and something to say about what we ought to be doing. But before we can do that, let's talk about cumulative records because they're going to figure in this story. I hope most of you are familiar with cumulative records. They're not as common as they used to be. When I was a student, right from my undergraduate course in which we had um, experimental lab, an introductory site in which we, each little group in the course I took with Fred Keller, we had our own little chamber and we had rats pressing a lever and we generated our first cumulative recorders and we actually, cumulative records, and we actually saw the pen stepping up across the paper each time the rat pressed the lever. This is a sort of generalized look at what a cumulative record is. Um, there's this drum that rotates. There's a roll of paper that rolls over the top of the drum. There's a pen that's connected to a drive, and the pen starts at what will be the bottom of the page, and the drum at a constant rate moves the paper along so that the pen draws a line on the paper. If nothing happens, it stays there near the bottom. But every time the rat or the pigeon or whatever organism's behavior you're recording makes a response, it moves the pen over a little bit toward the top of the page. And so this line then gives a moment-to-moment picture of just when responding occurs. And because the pen will move more quickly across the page if the rate of responding is high than if it's low, you end up seeing different slopes, different rates of responding. So this graph gives you some representative pictures. You can have a high rate of responding, a steep line, as in this example A, a shallower line, B, the responding is slower. This is roughly half the rate of responding in A. There's practically no responding in C, but if you blow it up and you look at the detail, you can see that each of the little blips here corresponds to a time in which a response occurs. Here we see there were two responses close together, then a pause, three responses, but the cumulative record shows you very clearly how these responses are distributed in time. Now, if you spend a lot of time looking at these things, you could see all kinds of differences in detail. So for example, E, which is a little bit choppy, means you have little cases of a little burst, short burst of responding, and then a pause, and a burst, and a pause. Whereas in F, responding is more steady. It tends to go along. So E would be what you'd get if you had patterns like this, and F would be what you get if you had a steadier, less interrupted pattern. But you know, the pattern doesn't, the rate of responding doesn't stay the same. You can have responding start fairly quickly and then slow down, or start slowly and then speed up. This is called deceleration. This is called acceleration. And then if you really want to get fancy about it, you can have little pips produced by the pen. You can have a little thing that makes it jiggle every once in a while. And they could mark other events. Like in this record, each one of these little pips could represent when lever press of the rat produced a food reinforcer. If the food reinforcers came at regular time intervals, repeating time intervals in what we call a fixed interval, you could see what we call scallops. Responding starts slow, speeds up, reinforcer is delivered. Slows down again, speeds up, a reinforcement is delivered. And you see this regular pattern repeating itself. You can even make it stand out a bit more by having the pen reset to the bottom after each reinforcer so you can compare the heights of these. And then you can have the pen be displaced to show the effects of different cities. You can do all kinds of things. Now you say, why in the world should we care about that? Well, I'll tell you that in a minute, but let's first have our first poll question so you get a sense of what doing that is like if you haven't done that kind of thing before. Over
All
to
right.
Marissa.
True or false, in a cumulative record, when response rate goes up, the slope gets steeper. Go ahead and lock in your answer. A blue box should have popped up on your screen and you should be able to choose one and press the submit button. Now, if you want to earn CEUs, you need to participate in these poll questions. It's okay if you get the answer wrong, although please do not try, please try to get the answer correct so this way we know where you guys stand in understanding the content. But if you do happen to get it incorrect, it's not going to count against you for earning your CEUs. And I'm not sure if I already said this within this poll question, but if you didn't purchase already, go ahead and do that. I'll be analyzing this data so you can get your certificates by lunchtime tomorrow. All right, I'll shut this down. Thanks for voting, everybody. Oh, wow, it looks like 94% say true and 6% say false.
Okay, those other 6%, pay attention. We'll be having some more coming up later. Okay, so how can these cumulative records be relevant to guns in our culture? One of my replies is that we have to see the problem before we can deal with it. If it's hard to get a good look at these things, and yeah, we see things in the newspaper, but if you were standing there in a lab and you had a look into a chamber in which some animal was responding, and it speeded up and slowed down, and you got a general impression of what was going on, you still might not be able to say whether in the early couple of minutes you were looking, the animal was going faster or slower than in the later couple of minutes when you happen to be looking. Looking at it in details can make a difference. Now, of course, you can just do frequency distributions. They can show trends, but then the question is, what kinds of things do you look at? This is a graph that shows active shooter incidents, so that each little blob here is one incident in which there is an active shooter in what have been categorized as mass shootings. And we can see clearly here that from 2001 on to 2021, it's becoming more and more frequent, but we don't have any idea within this. This is the number of incidents. This does not tell us how many people were shot. It doesn't tell us anything about all sorts of things. I was impressed by some questions about the data, and I discovered that, in fact, there are sources in which you can go, for example, to the magazine Mother Jones, and their online site has a collection of data which they've maintained now for many years on mass shootings. And the thing that's important about their doing it is that they categorize it by the kind of weapon that was used. They have criteria for counting these as mass shootings. So, for example, a shooting in the course of a crime, like a bank robbery, would not count. What they were concerned about were the kinds of shootings where somebody just comes along and arbitrarily seems to be shooting people. So I didn't feel up to the job of trying to make those distinctions. So it turns out to be fairly convenient to have a pool like that. So I tried playing around at one point. I don't remember exactly what got me to do it, um, with some of these things. And this is one of my very early attempts of graphing some of these things. And this was from the oh yeah, it was a paper in the Washington Post, and they listed some of the mass shootings over time, and these were just separate incidents, and I decided to just play around with doing a cumulative record. So here you had some that were records occurring in the 1960s, in the 1980s. Then during a period of 10 years, from 1994 to 2004, there was the assault weapons ban. And one of the things that fascinated me when I plotted these data was that the slope seemed to be, there was an ascending graph here, and the slope seemed to decrease for a period of time during the assault weapons ban. And after the ban was ended, the rate actually went up even more steeply. Now, this was a really surprising thing to see. This particular point is Columbine, April 1999, 13 dead plus the shooters. They took their own lives. Virginia Tech was 32 dead plus the shooter. So these were unheard of incidents. And by the way, these particular ones were not automatic weapons. These were other kinds of guns. So I didn't know quite to do with them. I was talking to some people. In those days, I was regularly going swimming some mornings a week. And I was talking about this stuff with a couple of people I'd come to know in the locker room. And one of them said, well, why don't you send it into Rachel Maddow's blog? I didn't even know that Rachel Maddow had a blog at the time. Um, and um, and I followed up on that, and eventually I came up with a different graph. I just essentially these are the same data, but this time uh, showed where the assault weapons ban occurred. And here it even becomes this makes this graphically a little bit easier to think about because the graying out this area makes you see the other graph as one that has a bit more continuity to it. And this did show up on the blog. And then later I decided to play around with more detail. If you get rid of the years of the ban and you get rid of those 10 years, you can see that the function is a fairly smooth function and it's accelerating, except the thing we're plotting now is not rats lever presses or pigeons keypecks. We're plotting gun deaths post World War II. There's not much in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, and maybe some of that is the collection of news. There may be a whole bunch of different variables, but if we look at this function here, this is scary because it is increasing over the years and getting steeper and steeper and steeper. Rachel Maddow actually eventually did cite uh, what had been shown in the blog, and at the time in the blog I got comments from other people. There were things going back and forth, and then one day I got an email from a woman who worked with Rachel Maddow and helped her set things up, and she essentially the main body of the email was, "How do you pronounce your name?" And that's a problem enough. Catania. Well, the simple way to spell that up is to say rhymes with Britannia. And so I sent that back in and it made me suspicious. And sure enough, within a short time after that, Rachel Maddow talked on air about these data, but she didn't present any of the cumulative records. She instead showed it was essentially a graph showing number of deaths in blocks of time to show that it was much, much more within a later decade than in later decades than the earlier decades. But she did quote me, so I do have my, my few seconds of fame. And she quoted me as saying, "These were the scariest data I have ever plotted." And that's a line I think I used earlier on when I showed you that. Um, and I then generated this graph, which I've since used in other places. And it does show some events that are memorable ones, sadly, tragically memorable. Columbine, Virginia Tech, Newtown, Orlando. Notice Orlando, that was not one of the most uh, recent ones. Of course, we don't have Uvalde on this list yet. We're talking about it ending around 2016. This was a little while ago. Um, uh, this is the updated version. The earlier one ended around 2015. It shows the data running through this part of the graph. And by the way, in here is that period of time during which the assault weapon ban occurred, but the big jump here is mainly because of Columbine. But now if you look since then, notice what the slope is now. It's now not a surprise. Practically every day in the newspaper, you'll see something about shooting. And this, by the way, is still using the same criteria. These are, again, the data accumulated based on the Mother Jones data set. Now let's see what you folks will be able to remember about what we've just been talking about. Here's poll question 2.
Okay, everybody. So, which is true about the assault weapons ban? The bill was never passed, it reduced mass shootings to zero, it became permanent, or none of the above is true. Alrighty, thank you all for voting. I'll shut this down in about 3, 2, and 1. Perfect. And here are the results. Looks like 16%
Okay.
said the bill was never passed, 8%
Well, it
say
was. Yeah.
16% say it was never passed, 8% say it reduced mass shootings to zero, 0% say it became permanent, and 76% say none of the above is true.
Most of the folks got it. So again, getting back, it was of course passed. It lasted for 10 years. That was the sad thing. It did not become permanent, but it was passed. And I thought I had sufficiently emphasized that Columbine occurred right in the middle of that time. And there were a couple of other smaller incidents also during that time. So it did not reduce behavior to zero, which by the way is going to be significant, because when we move on to talking about these kinds of data and we talk about causation and so forth, if something has multiple causes, it's hard to get rid of all the multiple determinants and reduce things all the way. But we'll get back to that. Let's get back to the topic. Why do we want to even limit the data to those called mass shootings? What about other statistics, including all deaths from firearms? I mean, we can get upset about those that just seem crazy, and I use that word advisedly, because one of the things is the extent to which, for political reasons, people want to worry about mental health being what's involved and not the availability of guns. But if we look at guns, I mean, we're finding that the alcoholism, oh dear, I've just forgotten what the T is. And firearms, the ATF does include data on records of licensing for firearms and so forth. And we see that, except for this jump in 2016, think about what happened that year. Suddenly people were told that they ought to be sure they get guns, because maybe certain parties were going to try to limit their availability, and availability and sales of guns went way up, and they've been going up ever since. This is how the population of our country is increasing the availability of guns. This is a record of how gun ownership has, we now have well over 400 million guns produced and imported for the US market. That's when you start thinking about those numbers, you know, the population of the United States is the same ballpark. This is like a gun for every person in the country, except some people have a lot more than one. And sometimes we don't need a cumulative record to see trends. If you look at firearm deaths overall, no matter what the source, accidental shootings, hunters accidentally shooting people, children killing friends or siblings because somebody left a gun lying around unprotected. If you look at all of those kinds of deaths, you find that we're talking about per year. You're talking about 30,000 at this level here. So it's above that level most of this time for this graph between 1980 through 2020. And we see that it went up through the 1990s, and then it came down leading up to the beginning of our new century. I still find it hard to talk about the turn of the century accurately. That was the turn of the century, but most of my lifetime, the turn of the century was 1900, way before I was ever born. But anyway, since that time, gun deaths went down. Since that time, it's been growing and growing and growing and growing. And with a special jump, look at the size of the jump just in the past 2 or 3 years. We have an enormous increase from, look at what that difference is. This is not a relative scale in which they chop off the x-axis. This starts at 0, and we're talking about 30,000 back here to more than 50,000 here. That's, if it goes up, if it keeps going up at this rate, that will be essentially that's a doubling of deaths per year. And by the way, you could weight this by population, and that'll make some of these effects smaller, but the general trends remain the same. In this particular case, if you do the cumulative record, you can see the trends. The slope is a little steeper here, and then it's shallower here, and it's becoming steeper. So the cumulative deaths we're talking about is roughly 1.5 million people killed by guns in this period of time over a little more than 4 decades. That's a lot of people. But now here's the other critical thing. The rate of child gun deaths, the rate has been worse. And guns are now the leading cause of death among children and teenagers. And again, if we start back in over the same period of time, we'll see the curve going steeper for a while, increasing more quickly and then coming shallower. And we're talking now again about 150,000 deaths of children and kids in this period of time. But the politicians keep saying that these, and the courts say that this was written into the Constitution. But the Constitution said something about to maintain a militia. It was, and nowadays the rhetoric seems to be that you really need the guns to defend yourself against the government, which is out to get you. We live in very dangerous and difficult times. Another source of deaths from guns, I mean, some of it's accidental, but some is deliberate. If we look at homicides and suicides, okay, notice the deaths by suicide exceed the deaths by homicide. So again, during that period of time, we see that trend for the increase and then the decrease around the 1990s with respect to homicides. And then we see them going really up in recent years. Suicides have been less affected over time. Again, if we look cumulatively, we can see that the cumulative gun deaths by suicide, I mean, it doesn't take much to extrapolate this on. If you extrapolate it around to 2030 or so, you're talking about 1 million suicides with guns. If you extrapolate to that date, you're talking about 800,000 murders with guns. When I think about behavior analysis and the things that we can do, and the fact that with many of the things which we do well, like working with a child who's on the autism spectrum, we're working one-on-one. We're talking about numbers that are so far beyond the levels at which we can do things that this is daunting. But we're behavior analysts. We at least have to recognize that killing people is behavior too. And a lot of civilizations in the world for a long, long time have gone about their business by getting others to do things by killing them. That's the kind of thing that Putin has been trying to do in the Ukraine. That's the kind of thing that goes on in lots and lots of countries. We can pick out there's civil wars all over the world. When I was growing up, it was supposed to be that at the end of World War II, people would come to their senses and that we'd have a long, peaceful time. But no, along came the conflict between us and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union eventually fell. That didn't fix things. And we find conflict all over the world, and only rarely do we find that reinforcing contingencies are involved. Very, very much what goes on in the world involves aversive contingencies, and we're kind of averse to even studying that. This gives us a picture of how important these topics are. Here's another picture of death by gender. If you're a woman, you're a bit safer. Firearm deaths by gender. Look at the difference between deaths among males and deaths among females. Deaths by firearm. Still too much under either of those things, but there is a huge gender difference. And this is without even getting into other kinds of dimensions like race and ethnicity and socioeconomic status and a whole bunch of variables we get introduced, whether you live in an urban environment or a suburban environment or an urban environment. All of these variables make a difference. And a lot of the data are available. I mean, I've drawn these from federal sources. I've already mentioned the Mother Jones source. So now let's look again at the earlier cumulative record. So if we look at this and we compare it to some of these other graphs that we looked at, I mean, they're increasing, but they don't show the kind of acceleration in any of these other graphs if you look at the cumulative thing, the right side of this one, which is the gender difference, the right side of this one, which includes homicides versus suicides, even the deaths of children. None of these show the effect that we see if we look at the original mass shootings. This has a kind of acceleration to it that is scarily different, and it got lost when it was embedded in the overall records. What is it about the mass shootings that makes its trend seem so different? Is it maybe hate speech on social media? Is it the availability of automatic weapons, or about the ammunition that goes into them, or the kinds of clips you can use? Is it because mental illness is untreated and there are a lot more people out on the streets who in previous decades would have been in mental hospitals? Is it that there's a lot more violence going on? Have the TV shows and the movies uh, constantly been outdoing themselves to show something that's more violent than what they've seen before? Is it violent games and films? We behavior analysts know that aversive stimuli increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior. Is poverty doing that kind of thing too? Is it racial and ethnic and gender prejudice? We could go on and on and on. But notice what the question is. The question is, what are the causes? And the phenomenon, and the reason that I'm presenting it this way, is that the change in the mass shootings really seems to be qualitatively different in the way it's been changing over time than um, homicides versus suicides, or male versus female, with regard to gender, um, with regard to overall trends. This one seems very different. So let me ask you a question about it now.
Alrighty, so the leading cause of death among US children is, and go ahead and lock in your answer, everybody. And just a quick question that I see in this in the box actually. What platform did you use to create those graphs?
The platform. Oh, I did those. Well, some of them I did a while back with a thing called Delta Graph, which was a program. But nowadays, if I'm doing graphs, I find it's fairly convenient to do it in Excel. Excel allows you to do graphs. You can do the labeling. I'm not as good at labeling, and I have to learn some of the tricks in doing that, but it's fairly easy to just, you can take a data set like the one provided by Mother Jones. You can just copy the whole table. Then you can pull out the columns. You can pick out the columns you want to use, and I use the ones that involve deaths, excluding the shooters, by the way. And then it's easy enough to, in an Excel program, to write a little program that will give you a new column which accumulates the numbers rather than shows you the numbers from one incident to the next. And then you have to pick the year column and that cumulative column, and there's a way in PowerPoint in which you can choose those and then have it draw a graph for you. It takes a little playing around with it. I'm still not really fluent in it, but all of these PowerPoint, I'm sorry, Excel really is getting more and more powerful as a graphics medium as well. I'd rather be using some other programs. There are things I used to do with Delta Graph I can't do with Excel, or at least I don't know how to do it. So in the other program, which now is no longer runs on the newer systems because it used an earlier processor, I used to be able to take a three-dimensional graph and be able to rotate it very easily. And I'd like to be able to do that because if you're talking about multiple causation, it's nice to be able to represent multiple dimensions. Anyway, how did they do on this question, by the way?
All right, here are the results again. It was 98% guns and 2% traffic accidents.
Where were the folks who said it was traffic accidents? Folks, where were you? Okay. Well, now that's essentially. I'll come back and talk a little bit and show a little bit of graphical, have a little bit more in graphic presentation. But now let's talk a bit about these kinds of things. Let's look at causes. You get the political arguments, and it's because of the political arguments that it seemed important to bring this up. Do guns kill people, or do people kill people? Well, most of this is presented to us, especially by politicians, in terms of a way of thinking about causes that's really kind of primitive. It's like the old billiard ball idea of causation. This thing either does or does not make something happen, as if nothing else mattered. One of the remarkable things that Skinner did in his book Verbal Behavior was to make it clear how important the concept of multiple causation is. Many things converge to make something happen. My saying a sentence like we need to consider multiple causation is a bit of verbal behavior that is determined by a whole bunch of things. It's determined by you being out there as an audience. It's determined by the context of the preceding things I've already put in these slides. Um, each term in that sentence had different determinants, and all of them had to come together. If I look out my window here, which I can see the sky and all, and I see a bird flying by, and I said, "Look at the bird flying by." You've got a whole bunch of things. It's got the you. You've got to be the audience for my saying that. I've got some behavior I'd like to get you to engage in, and but then I'm talking about a bird, not an airplane, not a dog or a cat on the ground. It's flying. It's not roosting. It's not walking. Um, and I'm talking in present tense. It's flying by right now. Each of those dimensions determines that brief little sentence, which is at the moment one response determined under a particular set of circumstances. All of those things have to come together, and take any one of them away, maybe it won't happen at all. Uh, but to talk about any one of them by itself being the cause just doesn't make sense. Well, politicians talk as if that was the case, though. And so you have these arguments that you can see if you read editorials and op-ed pieces and political statements. There'll be people arguing about whether, oh no, it's not the guns, it's mental health, and what we've got to do is something about that, as if that by itself would eliminate the problem. We need a different kind of language than the traditional language of causation, and I don't even like the idea of using causation in this. Philosophers tend to criticize the language of causation and say that in some sense we can't distinguish it from simple accidental juxtapositions. But we know about contingencies, and contingencies are descriptions of the probabilities with which some things make other things happen. We deal with that kind of stuff all the time. So what happens if we try to talk about guns in that way? Well, let's use first a simpler example. You're at a fast food restaurant, and consider it. It's lunchtime, it's the time at which you usually eat in the past. You've got all kinds of physiological determinants. Your metabolism is changing and things of that sort. So that's going to make the food important. When you're there in the fast food restaurant, you've got signs up there. Well, maybe you're not even. We can recast this, by the way, for COVID times if you want, and do this online and so forth, and place an order with DoorDash or something like that. But let's stick with just walking into a fast food restaurant like in the good old days. So you're in there and you see the food names on the menu up on the wall. You also have other people being served on either side of you and the servers. And so somebody is mentioning a particular thing that this person is ordering one thing and that person is ordering another thing. So you're hearing these names. You do see the food being passed out. Maybe that's the kind of fast food restaurant where you actually see the food on display there. Then you got the server asking you for your order. The server is a discriminative stimulus in the presence of whom, if you then say, please give me this or give me that, you're going to get it. These are all the different things that are going on at the same time. And they will end up, maybe you just heard somebody else order something and you just saw it as well. And that just works because this particular time. And so that's what you end up ordering. If somebody had said something else or they had different dishes being handled at the moment that you were there ready to place your order, you might have ordered something else. So now, once you place your order, now we could add the verbal behavior categories to the causes of your order. The fact that it's lunchtime is a motivating operation or establishing condition. You see the food names on the menu, you say them as you see the names, that's textual behavior. You tend to maybe repeat yourself what you hear other people saying. To that extent, it's echoic. If you're actually seeing the food, that's a tact. And when the server asks for your order, you're placing the order as manding, right? And so we could go on and we can now name all of these things. We can list them. And so the point here is that many variables are causing this single event. Many variables are acting upon this response. You're placing your order, asking for a particular thing that you're going to get handed you across the counter. But how about this one? Okay, and this is essentially a question for you. You enter a building, there's an elevator there. You walk to the elevator and you press the call button on the elevator. Little time goes by, the elevator door opens, you go in. Inside, you press the button for your destination floor. You see the floor number light up and it's got a thing on the inside the elevator which shows you what floor you're on. And eventually you get to your floor and the door opens and you leave the elevator. As you get out of the elevator, a sign on the wall points to the room you're heading for, and you go and follow that sign. You get to the room, you turn the doorknob, you enter the room that you were going to when you got into the building. So you have that whole sequence of events, okay? Why, I ask you, is this not a good example of multiple causation? It's because these are a whole sequence of different responses. You're seeing the elevator produces one response, pressing the button and having the door open. That's a new response, which is followed by a different consequence. Then you've got another response. They're happening one after another. And it's not that a whole bunch of things are operating on any one of them all at the same time. Because of the way buildings and elevators and getting from one place to another works, because of the physics of it, you have to go through this stuff sequentially. That's why you can't ever get away from chaining. Yeah, you can have integrated sequential behavior, but this, you can't do the one thing until the stimulus comes up. You can't do the next thing until the appropriate stimulus comes up. If you try to enter the elevator before the door opens, you can end up with a bloody nose. So why is this not a good example of multiple causation? It's because we speak of multiple causation only when all of several variables act together on a single response, not when it works on a succession of different ones. And you think I'm sort of beating a dead horse here. I guess that's an ugly metaphor, isn't it? I'm overdoing it with this, but the reason I do it is that I've done this in courses over the years, and I find that when I ask for examples of multiple causation, I sometimes get examples like this kind of sequential stuff, and that just doesn't hack it. You want the case in which you've got a whole bunch of things all producing the single response, placing your order, not a whole sequence of things, each of which cannot occur until after the last one has occurred. So I think that warrants another question. So here's your other question.
Alrighty, everybody. Which presented as good example of multiple causation? Using an elevator, ordering at a fast food restaurant, both A and B, or neither A and B? Alrighty, thank you all for voting so quickly. I'm going to shut this down in about 3, 2, and 1. Perfect.
I sure
Awesome.
hope this was an
It looks like 69% said ordering food at a fast food restaurant, 21% said A and B, and 10% said neither A or B.
Well, that frankly shocks me. I thought I had emphasized very clearly that the fast food restaurant example was a good example of multiple causation, and I was contrasting it with the one of the sequential stuff, which was not. And that is the main message of this entire presentation, folks. So those of you who missed it, if you presumably, if you're somebody taking these poll questions, you've also downloaded the handout. I'd suggest going back and reviewing it because this is a very fundamental point. It's a really important point about a lot of things we deal with. If you don't recognize the difference between many things working together on a single response or a sequence of different responses which cannot occur together, that's a very fundamental thing to get straight. I'm almost tempted to repeat the question a little bit later on, but let's move on because we have a limited time, and I do want to reserve some time later on for questions and comments about these things. I'll remind you that in most of these talks that I've been doing, we have some others coming up in the future. We're deliberately trying to reserve some time to encourage interaction with the folks who are attending, and I hope we'll get some discussion. These issues are so important. I'd like to hear back from you folks. So what I'm going to do now is to talk about a different way of discussing causation. I want to talk in terms not of causes, but in terms of thresholds. Okay, let's imagine you've got a population. Could be individuals, it could be a population of different responses, it could be any kind of population which they vary, and in which something happens only if that for that member of the population things go above a certain threshold. So if you've ever been getting an eye exam, I happen to have had one just fairly recently, and one of the things that you do is they sometimes, if they're interested in your visual field, they will put you in a thing in which you're looking at um, um, at an array, and you stare at a fixation point, and then at different places in this field that you're looking at, a little light comes on. Okay. And so sometimes the light comes up on your upper right, and sometimes it comes out straight to your left, and sometimes it's really close to the center of vision, the foveal area, sometimes it's way, way far out. And what they do during this test is they make that little light brighter or dimmer, and you report by pressing a button whether you've seen it or not. And on the basis of that, they can construct how good your vision is in the retinal periphery. So if it turns out that for some individual where or if you're looking at, say, a particular place where the thing appears, this could be all the different places where that stimulus appears, if the light is bright enough that it exceeds the point at which you can say, I see it, it's exceeded that threshold. If the light gets much brighter, still, it might have to be, well, I'm sorry, let me get this straight. The further out into the periphery you get, the more light you need if you're going to see it. Out in the periphery, the cells are getting scarcer and scarcer, the densest right in the middle, and they get scarcer as you move out. So if you're looking close to the center of vision, it doesn't take much for the light to get over the threshold. And lights coming out in these different places, you're going to report that you see all of them. If you move a little further away from the center of vision, they have to be brighter for you to see them. And if the light's not bright, so only these few are high enough. And if you get way, way out into the periphery, they got to be really bright for you to see them. So only a certain proportion of the lights that they present are going to show. The difference is that the threshold is lower. You don't need as much energy for you to say, I see it, if the light's close to the fovea, as you do if it's a little bit further out, or as if you do if it's even still further out. So yes, the light that you eventually report is the stimulus that is the cause or the occasion set for your saying, I see it, or pressing the button and essentially telling the tech who's running this procedure for you that you see it. But what's changed, what we have is a more sophisticated analysis of what's going on because the thresholds are changing. So we could look at other kinds of behavior that way. Maybe these are different children, and we have a we're asking children questions, and we give a particular hint. And hint C is such that a lot of the kids don't answer the question, uh, but a few of them do. Hint B isn't anywhere near as good because only a few can answer the question then, and hint A only works for one of the kids, and all the rest don't even get it. So the thresholds for being able to answer the question are changed by the hints. We might be able to give another hint. We would actually, if we were teachers, we'd eventually want to get the thresholds down here so that just about any kid is going to be able to answer this question if we were teaching. But now, um, let's suppose we switch our attention not to those kinds of examples, which we might encounter in a teaching situation or in a thing where somebody is testing our vision or testing our hearing or any of a variety of things that happen to us as individuals. But let's suppose we're looking at a very large population of people. And there are people who come from all walks of life and they live in different places and they've got different kinds of backgrounds and so forth. Some of them may actually go so far as to take a gun and go and try to shoot somebody. So let's ask about the probability of shooting somebody um, where A is the unlimited availability of guns. Well, maybe there's only going to be one person in this very large population for whom the response of shooting just rises above threshold enough. But supposing then that we convert to actually what we're living through right now, especially in some parts of the country, it's really hot. And this would have been even more so the case in the old days before air conditioning. Uh, Riots and crime have been shown to increase when you have hot weather and less air conditioning and a lot more people outdoors. So hot weather lowers the threshold so that now a few people who would not have gotten so far as to shoot somebody, now you get several who do. And by the way, this is not so far from being hypothetical. We've had shootings recently as near as I live in Columbia, Maryland. Um, we've had several shootings both in Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And if you look at the news lately, they're occurring all the time. And the hot weather doesn't help. More people are outdoors. And those are really specific and realistic examples. I'm not just making this up. These things happen. Hot weather and the threshold goes down. It's easier for something to rise above threshold and you have more incidents. And then there's violent talk. Does violent talk make a difference? Well, we as behavior analysts have done lots of research in which we find correlations between what people say and what people do. So if you've got charismatic populations talking about violence and so forth, we might not be surprised that that lowers the threshold even a bit more. Essentially, you've gotten permission that it's okay to talk this way, and once you talk this way, maybe you're going to behave this way. So the combination of having guns available and then lowering the threshold in the hot weather and then having a lot of violent talk besides, and you're going to have more of these incidents. So what we really have when we look at recent history is a change in the thresholds for these kinds of events. And of course, one of the big things that has to be incorporated in it is we know darn well that if you don't have guns out there, shootings are not going to happen. Um, There were fewer around back in those days. In more than 100 years ago, when my mother took her younger brother, escorted him to that movie theater. Uh, the story at the time was that probably it was some gang or maybe some criminal groups. There was a lot of crime around in those days too. Wasn't during Prohibition when there was a lot more, but somebody got rid of a gun in that alley and it had ammunition in it. And the Peter, who would have been my uncle, never got the chance to grow up. These are real things we're talking about, not just hypothetical ones. Um, but the language of thresholds introduces something different because once we're talking that way, any variable becomes a candidate for working on because any variable that would raise the thresholds a little bit, that would make things a little, if a lot of air conditioning would raise the thresholds and reduce the number of gun deaths, then some people who might have been shot won't get shot and they will live. And that is something that's big enough consequence that it ought to matter to us, even if we don't have the means of doing something immediately. I'm going to come up with some comments now, but in the face of this, they were going to seem little things, but and it's going to take a lot because there's another kind of threshold we would like to see reached, which is the threshold of getting enough politicians together to pass some laws that can make a difference. And as long as we got weird verbal behavior in which causes are talked about in a totally unrealistic way, we're not going to get there. Maybe it's going to be slow in coming, but to the extent that we can get these ways of thinking out there to the broader public, maybe it's going to take a long time. Maybe things will make a difference. And of course they'll get more complicated because sometimes these different things that will change the threshold interact with each other. Of course, it's not a simple business, but thinking in terms of thresholds is, I believe, a much more realistic way to talk about looking for ways to change behavior, to change the law, and so forth. So here's the thing. When an event has multiple significant causes, it's very hard to demonstrate that any one of them matters because if you have statistics and this particular variable is embedded in a whole bunch of other ones, the statistics are hard to demonstrate. You know, is it mental health? Um, uh, but if you can show that statistically you make just a tiny difference and that saves a certain number of lives, that again might be a more effective way to talk about things. So we've been talking about the language of causes. Um, let's have one more question now. Here's another
Uh,
poll question.
so, an analysis of which of the following might be an improvement over talking about causes of gun deaths. Go ahead and lock in your answer. Oh, thank you everyone for voting so quickly. I'll shut this down in 3, 2, and awesome. All right, so it looks like 7% say guns owned versus guns sold. 86% say thresholds. No one says availability of ammunition, and 7% say mental illness.
Okay. All right. So let's have a little bit more, and then I'm gonna. So what do we have to work with? Supposing we want to change gun behavior. Whose behavior matters most? Legislators, manufacturers, gun users, gun collectors? Let's hang on to that one for a minute. Actually, I probably should have done this slide as the kind of one where the other ones came on a little bit at a time. Once we're talking about multiple causation, we've got to recognize that every one of these makes a difference. The more gun users there are out there, the more manufacturers there are, legislators. I didn't even mention all of the legal folks who will get cases and make money on defending things and going to court for people who may be users and gun collectors. A gun collector who is careless about locking things at home and who leaves things where a child can get it. I mean, it's fairly frequently, if you read the papers, you'll hear a story of a 5-year-old who kills a sibling because a gun was left around and the kid picked it up and played with it. Not so different from the friend who shot my would have been Uncle Peter. Um, uh, there's money to be made, but still there is tremendous resistance even to things like safe guns, which are guns, for example, which are sensitive to fingerprints, the same way as on your cell phone or your iPad or some of your other devices now. Instead of a password, you can open them by pressing your finger, and your fingerprint will do it. There are guns now, and there are devices can be attached to guns such that they will record the fingerprints of the owner so that somebody else can't use them. A certain number of gun deaths occur because somebody had a gun for defense, but somebody came in and maybe broke into a house and ended up getting the gun away from the owner. And so it turns out that it may be more dangerous to have the gun than to not have it under circumstances like that. Each of these groups, these are individuals whose behavior matters. And you might say, well, gee, they're so distant from it. Affect any one of these and change the threshold a little bit, and that might, over a period of years, save dozens, hundreds, many more lives. Every one of these things can make a difference. What about imposing response costs? We do know that response costs can make a difference. Their political clout in voting and so forth could help, because politicians can pass laws that require taxes. And it doesn't just have to be taxes on guns, and it doesn't just have to be taxes on the manufacturers. It could be taxes on ammunition. It could be taxes on all sorts of things related to guns. It could be taxes on the clips that are used to turn a weapon into one that can fire more shots. Um, Lawsuits create response costs. Supposing that somehow eventually we got over the stranglehold of the NRA so that manufacturers did have legal liabilities. Supposing there were criminal penalties if guns are used in certain ways. Would response costs make a difference? It does in a lot of other cases. We tend to avoid aversive control, but the consequences here involve such aversive stuff already that if these are things that would make a difference and are available, maybe we have to consider them. There are some circumstances under which punishers work. We tend not to think about these things as the same in the same uh, range as when we worry about electric shock as used as an aversive stimulus. But these are response cost is an aversive contingency. But if we really want to reduce these behaviors, if we want to raise the thresholds so that the shootings are less likely to occur, and this helps that to happen, we probably want to consider that, and we ought to work not only with the opportunities we have to vote, but also to the extent that we do have any clout in talking to legislatures, in lobbying, and all of those kinds of things. For those people who can manage it, if you see the opportunities, take advantage of it. Lives are at stake. Then what are the other things we think about? What are the reinforcers and how can we change them? When we see self-injurious behavior, we do functional analyses. Where are the functional analyses of mass shootings? Are they even feasible? One of the things we know about is that aversive stimuli and extinction increase the likelihood of aggressive behavior. There was a researcher named Ron Hutchinson. He worked with Nate Azrin and other people in the early days of studying punishment and so forth. And it would be experiments like the following. You have a pigeon pecking on a key, and the pigeon's somewhat food deprived. It doesn't have to be very food deprived, by the way. people sometimes have referred to experiments with pigeons reduced to 80% body weight as starvation research, but the fact of the matter is most pigeons that live out there in the wild, around Trafalgar Square, and all the places where people go and feed pigeons, those pigeons probably maintain themselves around 70% of body weight. So reducing a bird from 100% from the weight it would be if you give it totally unlimited food for a month or so is actually not getting the bird down to the level it would be if it lived out on its own. And in fact, when I was used to work with pigeons, the argument would be that the vets would come and say our pigeons were overweight, even though they were at 80%. But at that level, they will work for food. Well, if you got a bird that's pecking away and its pecks occasionally produce food, and it's in a chamber where at the other end of the chamber you have a model pigeon with maybe some feathers and things on it. And now you switch from its pecks producing food, you switch to extinction. Its pecks now suddenly don't do anything. You wait just a little bit, you'll find that after its pecks stop producing food, it will suddenly turn around and go over to that model pigeon and start pecking at it. Extinction is an aversive event. You're taking away food that used to be readily available, and the response to it is to attack another pigeon. Well, what happens when you take resources away from people? Well, Ron Hutchinson did a whole series of experiments that involved aversive events and what was called elicited aggression. And there was in those days a senator named Proxmire who made fun of some kinds of research and who gave awards to what he regarded as silly kinds of research. And Ron Hutchinson's work was singled out, and he was unable to get continued funding to follow up this work. And yet here we have a variable that nobody pays enough attention to. One of the other things that causes shootings and so forth is aversive environments. Kids who feel isolated in school, who get picked on by other kids. Aggression is produced by those kinds of aversive events, and we have bullying in schools, and yet we don't do enough about it. Certainly, if aversive events change the likelihood of aggression, one kind of aggression is getting a gun and killing somebody. And this happens, and it happens in schools, and it happens among kids. And it also is a thing that may be a side effect or a main effect of certain kinds of psychiatric disorders. So that's a place where we should look to change the thresholds. Not just one thing, but that's another thing along with all the others we've talked about. And what about verbal behavior? What about violence in movies and in film and TV shows? What about violent talk? If people engage more in violent talk, shouldn't we be worrying about what we know in other cases? If you shape what people say and what you shape is talk about what you do, then aren't politicians who engage in violent talk then augmenting this sort of thing and reducing the thresholds? My guess is the increased steepness of the curve that we talked about early on, and which is a significant property of contemporary things. This later part, back in the past decade or so, is a function of political talk has lowered the threshold for some of that kind of behavior. And so here again, we have politics entering into it. We behavior analysts don't have access to the right kinds of contingencies to change a lot of this, but at least we have the opportunity to teach it and to get it out there as much as we possibly can. So that's essentially the story. And I hope to spend more time talking about this. At some point, I plan to write it up in more detail. But here I have the chance to try out these ways of talking about things. Here is the chance for me to get some feedback. So I hope I've given you sufficient cause for some questions, and that is enough to bring at least a few of those questions up above threshold so that you'll provide them to. But before that, one last question for you.
Alrighty, everybody. So how many questions do you have for Dr. Catania? None?
Okay.
One? Or more than one? Alrighty, and thank you all for voting so quickly. I'll shut this one down in about 3, 2, and 1. Thank you.
Of course, there's
Awesome.
no right answer to this one, but you know what I'd like to see.
Alrighty, so it
Uh,
looks like most of everybody doesn't have any questions. Somebody has 13% have one question and 13% have more than a question for you.
those percentages represent enough people now that you'll get the questions to me. Okay, folks. Um, and I'll give you the chance to kind of look at the data that matter to us while we do that. Okay, any questions?
Alrighty, so far none in the questions box, but while I'll say some closing things about CEUs and stuff, just reminders and everything for everybody while people start to type in their questions, buy you some time, everyone. So let's see. Um oh, actually here's a question right here. Out of all the variables you have mentioned, which one do you think is the most important and should be addressed?
That that's the problem with the multiple causation thing, because the idea of the multiple causation is that any one of them can be effective, and we just don't have the data to really know that this one is going to be twice as effective as that one. Um, but certainly, I'd rather try to think in terms of which is most manageable. I would think that given all the present legal issues and so forth, um, a ban on assault weapons still makes a lot of sense. It is one that is manageable. If only we could get the expression is the political will. And of course, we as behavior analysts to talk about that as a variable that's manipulable is kind of silly, uh, but I think things that where we get a very broad consensus across the population are things like uh, getting rid of clips that involve many rounds to be shot in a short time and things of that sort. So I'm more thinking not if you gave me total control over it, getting rid of guns, period, would be one way of doing it. And we know there are some countries in which they're moving in that direction. Uh, but I don't see that as being realistic. Um, the other thing is uh, changing the economy so that you don't have so many people who are below the poverty line, so many. Yeah, I mean, I just find it as soon as I start thinking that way, I start thinking of several different things. And each of them is so important. What would we put ahead of the idea of just getting rid of bullying in school so that we don't create kids who are ready to do this kind of thing to their classmates? Um, and then we get people who do it, and they're out of school and they come back to a school that involves elementary school kids. Um, so I'm that's really the best I can do. We could have a vote on it, but I think the thing that would be helpful is to have some consensus of the ones that are practical and manageable and worth trying to, oh gee, multiple causation, trying to take a shot at. And by the way, I didn't mean that as a pun, but I point out that in everyday talk, multiple causation is always doing things like that. And when you do it deliberately, you're said to be punning. But that kind of multiple causation of verbal behavior is happening all the time, and it's another illustration of the same kinds of ways in which variables come together to produce a particular response. So I hope that's useful. I hope you can tell me I've dodged the question, but I guess I have.
Alrighty, so there's actually quite a few questions that developed in that time too. So let's get that. But I am actually just going to remind everybody about CEUs really quick before we get too much into Q&A. But go ahead and purchase your CEUs if you haven't already. You can do so in the store, and I'll be analyzing all the attendee and poll data from the webinar today on tomorrow morning as soon as I get back to my desk. So you'll have your instructions for how to access your CE certificate by lunchtime. If you only need a certificate of completion and you don't need CEUs, you don't need to purchase anything, and that certificate will come a few hours after we end here today. And it'll come in a thank you for attending email right to your inbox. And it'll have a bright orange button that says my certificate, and it won't have any ACE provider or BACB info on there, again, because it's just a certificate of completion. CE certificates will come tomorrow. But alrighty, let's get back into Q&A. Is there a compilation of potential causes of mass shooting somewhere? A place to start looking at causes for analysis.
Well, I hope that I provided the beginning of one. I don't think you'll find anything in any one place. You'll find lots of speculations. I've developed this over time by reading op-ed pieces and trying to keep up with the news and so forth. And uh, uh, the if, however, there are some things that are useful and tools. So, for example, the Mother Jones database has all sorts of things that you can pull out. You can sort it with respect to geography. Some states have higher incidences than others. You can do it by uh, they break it down into the kinds of guns used. Um, uh, it's a little trickier. You have to do your own evaluation as to where it takes place in schools. Yeah, sadly, some of them happen there, but some of them, like the big one that was in Las Vegas, or just outdoors, somebody shooting from a hotel window at a crowd below. Um, so there's virtually no limit. You can find all sorts of examples, but the question is whether some of them are significant enough that they suggest something that's manageable, something that could be done that might make a difference. There are also, if you do searches for gun deaths, you'll do a Google search and you'll find that there are several government databases. There are other news organizations besides Mother Jones. The Washington Post has had some, and some of them have categories that would enable you to sort things out that might suggest things. But I think uh, I, the political arguments usually are not particularly helpful, um, and I don't feel that you're going to get much out of the NRA sources. Um, so it's the kind of thing where well, I don't know. I haven't even gotten to the point of thinking that I might even write this up for a behavior analysis journal. So for the moment, you've got this as a source, and we'll try to leave this available for a little while. Um, and it's the kind of thing that's one of the difficult problems in our culture that's going to be developing over time. And this is just a suggestion that we behavior analysts had something to contribute to it. And anybody who is willing to take the time to develop it, I'd welcome other people joining me in this kind of an enterprise. And by the way, if you have any interest in doing some of this kind of research yourself, and please, I'd be happy to learn about it. My email address is straightforward enough. It's catania@umbc.edu, UMBC being the campus for which I'm still having an emeritus status. Um, and I am not in a position at this point to take on a lot more. I've been at this stuff for a while and I'm slowing down a bit. but I'd love to hear from people who want to pick it up and continue with it, and offer whatever help I can if you're willing to do that. There's plenty for us to do. And fortunately, there are now more and more of us. A cumulative record of the number of people who are now in the field of behavior analysis would be kind of fun to look at. I hope it would be steeply increasing in its slope, the way this kind of graph does, because we need to do that. Any questions that maybe have a different um,
Yeah, there's a few
any
more
other?
questions. Um, let's see. So, how do you view the idea of copycat?
Well, it's one more thing that it's like it's a bit like a politician talking about violence. And yeah, why pull punches? Uh, Trump has often uh, talked about and given instructions at some events that he was in. He would say, "Beat him up," right? Or lock her up, or so that that's actually a man. And even though he could say he was kidding if he wants to diminish the effectiveness later, that kind of thing coming from a person in a prestigious position is going to make a difference. Well, doing is also like that. If a prestigious person does some things, there may be some who then follow that. There are all kinds of social contingencies that have led some people to do what other people have done. So you tell kids, are you going to do anything your friends ask you to do? We ask kids to distinguish between the instructions you ought to follow and the instructions that you ought to ignore. But we also teach kids to imitate. I mean, you play imitation games. So you teach a kid, and Simon Says, do this, do that. And then Simon Says, do this and do that. So we have to recognize that in the ordinary course of education, um, some of the things we do is to have people imitate the things that we're doing. So if somebody actually ends up doing something like shooting a lot of people, that's going to lower the threshold a little bit so that somebody else might get to the point who is already close to doing it for all the other reasons, all of the other variables are there. That might be just the thing that tips the thing over threshold. And so, yeah, that probably happens too. And unfortunately, the media tend to be more likely to publicize the events that are most unusual and most dramatic. And by doing so, they enhance the likelihood that somebody else is going to copy it. Uh, this again is just strengthening the case that these are all instances of powerful multiple causation, and you can pick out these different variables. And as the first question came along, you can try to identify the most important one, but something might have been the thing that just brought things over threshold in one instance, and something totally different might have brought it over threshold in another instance. Finding the variables that are having the biggest effect is difficult. Um, so I hope these comments are helpful. But when I do this kind of thing, I usually feel that I'm just apologizing that we can't know as much as we need to know uh, to do the best we can. But after all, that's why we're behavior analysts. Raising the questions is a start, and I hope that this has helped with that.
Awesome. Alrighty. Did you want to take another question?
Sure.
Alrighty. So, just curious, is multiple causation similar to relation frame theory, which I have not delved into yet?
Uh, mm, I don't think it particularly is. In relational frame theory, what you're talking about is how um, once you have certain kinds of relationships, and particularly with respect to symbolic things and verbal things in their relation to the environment, uh, that you can organize a lot of stuff in terms of relational frames, and you can relate all kinds of behavior to other kinds of behaviors. So, just a quick example: in Northern Ireland, you have both the Protestant Irish and the Catholic Irish. Um, Protestant Irish tend to have different first names than Catholic Irish. The Catholic Irish tend to go with the green, and the Protestant Irish with the orange, and there are different flags and symbols correlated with each. There are parts of Northern Ireland that are identified with one group or another, so street names and towns. If you do, and what you would find is if you do a task in which you ask people to match these up, then a Catholic Irish person would match certain names with certain flags, with certain colors, with certain places, with certain activities, and the Protestant Irish person would come up with a different set of relations. Some of these would create, so there'd be one class that tends to hang together for the Protestant Irish, another class that tends to hang together for the Catholic Irish. And these would also be regarded as kind of frames within which all of these things get related to each other. And with that comes certain kinds of behavior with respect to within your group and outside your group. Emotional behavior then can get tied into that. So once you've got these organizations, um, relational frames may be helpful in telling you how these things could develop, but you might want to do a different thing. You want to take some of the items in one of these groups frames and try to teach somebody to match them up with the other. And it turns out it's hard for you to do that if you come from one or another of these groups. To match the Catholic Irish sounding name with the Protestant Irish orange or flags, if you try to teach somebody the task of matching those and saying they all belong to one class and that's different from the others, is hard to do. However, what's also interesting is um, if if you then look not at kids who are growing up in these different neighborhoods, but you look at students who've been through, say, the University of Belfast, and therefore have mixed with members of both groups, they find it easier to learn these new relationships. And that's because those kinds of associations are breaking down the things that create the boundaries between the classes. This, by the way, is a nice set of research done by a colleague of mine named Mickey Keenan, who teaches at the University of Belfast. So these are the kinds of issues that somebody might deal with if they're dealing with relational frames, but I'm not sure how you would apply that to multiple variables. Yes, there are multiple dimensions to all of these classes because you can match anything up. And the other thing is identifying the classes is saying something about how these classes are structured, but it doesn't say enough about how they're created. So I would not. Yeah, there are probably ways in which somebody who does that kind of who likes to approach things from that perspective might tackle these kinds of questions. But I think they'll be in a somewhat different way than we dealt with. The place which is the heart of the development of multiple causation is in Skinner's verbal behavior, and if you want to follow up on that, you can, I think, with some profit, read the chapters on multiple causations in Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, even if you skip over some of the other details, uh, because he gives a variety of examples, which I think are helpful in thinking about these things. I hope that's useful. But, okay, do we have a different kind of question to take a look at, or do you think we're
Yeah, we could do one more question. Let's see.
shot?
Let's see. I'm just trying to see. There's a lot of feedback in here. Okay, what do
Go
you
back.
suggest in determining effective red flag laws?
Say, could you repeat that one again?
What do you suggest in
I,
determining effective red flag laws?
red flag laws. Ah, that's tricky. So you're talking, I presume you're talking about the case in which some teacher or some students have reported some strange behavior on the part of one of the kids in a school, and uh, the other kinds of cases I can imagine are where some there have been some reports of behavior on the part of an abusive spouse or something, and this gets reported to the police along with uh, requests for boundaries and all. But if you're talking about the school situations, what we have is a situation where we've now got more and more controls over what teachers can do. There are concerns about privacy and what you can publicly talk about when you have strange behavior being observed on the part of a kid. And so you've got false alarms that can be raised. You can have a kid who's very shy and who draws some pictures of things that involve some ugly stuff and shootings. And for some kids, that'll go on, and the kid will become involved in art later on, and maybe making movies. Uh, but on the other hand, if what you miss is something where this kid is picking up guns and buying guns, or can get access to guns that the parent has in the house, then you don't want to miss that one. There again, the devil is in the details. Um, I think the tendency is to, usually we find that once one of these events happen, people start talking about, oh, look at all the things that we missed that were warning signs. But it is very, very difficult to take a warning sign and then go to talk with principals, have the teachers try to talk to parents. There's all sorts of pushback against that, especially given the culture we have in which people still want to defend their right to own guns. Um, I don't know whether laws making parents liable for shootings on the part of their children are going to make a difference. The consequences are so delayed and it's so hard to get that done, and it's going to be different in every one of the states. So I would say that teachers have to be alert. There have to be people who are in a position to at least watch kids who seem to be at risk to that kind of behavior. So, and to that extent, such flagging it is important. But it may be that there are other parts of our culture that have to be worked on more. It might be more important to find ways to get to talk to these kids, to reduce the amount of bullying in schools. There's a whole culture among kids, we hear about it, which uh, uh, kids start ostracizing other kids, and that's the kind of thing that leads to the aggressive response. That's aversive stuff too. And again, we know one of the things can lead this can sometimes lead to some kids committing suicide. Um, and that is not as much a newsworthy thing as a mass shooting, but it's as real, and kids' life ends because of it. Um, Once we're seeing that in terms of the multiple causes, it may be that reducing the level of the aversive stuff in school, and I don't know how we do that in any short time. I know that there's a lot of emphasis in the early grades of getting kids to behave more pro-socially and to support each other and all that. But unless we can do a good job of doing that, we're not going to get rid of a lot of the cliquish stuff. And some of that stuff begins at the home. If you've got a home that already includes a lot of prejudice, talking down other ethnic or racial groups, if those kinds of things are happening at the home and the kids bring these things into the classroom, and there's enough of a population that you do end up having divisions in the schools, that's something that has to be dealt with. But that's a big, big not a social problem. I don't want to sound too hopeless about it. Everything we do can make a difference, and if we saw these kinds of things increase, there must be variables that can make them decrease. And those are what we have to work at, and we have to resign ourselves to the fact that it's going to take a long time. And, we might not even see a lot of these changes even within our own lifetimes. And I mean, you're much longer uh, lifetimes from now than mine is, because I'm sort of moving along there. Um, been watching this stuff over many decades, but getting the newspapers to talk more about positive stuff would be probably a helpful thing too, but we don't have much control over the content of the papers. There's another set of variables. Um, but I wouldn't have presented any of this stuff if I didn't think there was something we could do about it and that it isn't worth doing. So let's be hopeful, and let's especially hope that politics moves in a direction that doesn't involve so much polarization, because unless we can move towards something where we have a more consistent political movement which does not tolerate at the highest levels of government uh, racist talk and abusive talk on the part of uh, people who are going to be role models. If we can't, so the voting booths do matter, and they're going to matter in the short term. So whatever else you do, make sure you get out there and vote. I won't tell you how to, but I think you can guess where I would have my recommendations based on what we've been saying so far. So thank you. Unless you've come up with something which is a question on a different line from what we've already said, I guess maybe it's time to wrap this up then. What do you think, Marissa?
Yeah, I think so. And just go ahead and purchase your CEUs. I'll have them ready for you guys tomorrow. If you have any questions, feel free to, email support@bds.com. But thank you so much for attending, and sign up for next month. And also, we have another webinar on Friday about telehealth, so you can go ahead and sign up for Friday session as well while you're there. And thank you so much, Dr. Catania, for doing this.
You appreciate the chance to talk about this stuff. So let's be hopeful, and
All right,
let's do the best to advance our field and keep helping it make a difference. Thanks.
alrighty, everybody. We'll see you next time. Have a great night. Bye.
Okay, bye.